I'm very pleased to introduce our next guest. At the Financial Review, we named him as one of the top 5 most powerful people in Australian technology. And as a politician, to get that moniker from the opposition benches is pretty impressive. He's the Shadow Minister for the Digital Economy and the Future of Work. So please join me in welcoming Ed Husic. There we go. A long round of applause for Ed Husic. I'm getting quite nervous about these chairs as well, so I was hoping Ed would sit the first and see if they can manage it. But now in this session, I'm going to have a chat with Ed. Please let me know by waving your hands if you have questions you would like to ask as well. And then towards the end of the conversation, our friend Mohit is going to come up as well, because he's spoken with some clients about some questions he wants to ask of Canberra as well. So he's going to join and ask a few questions as well. So please take a seat, Ed.
Thank you.
I will sit here. I guess I mentioned in the intro there
These
that
are very comfy, aren't they?
it is surprisingly comfortable. Yeah.
There's nothing awkward about them whatsoever.
No, this is how we hang out. This actually, Ed was telling me this room itself has a very personal past for him, so you can ask him later. But happy memories.
Nothing bad happened.
No.
This was where I held my wedding reception.
Yeah.
I'm now separated. Mohit, I don't want this to influence you in any way whatsoever.
But anyway, back to politics. I mentioned that you are one of our most powerful tech influencers in the country, and that from the opposition benches that maybe is surprising. Can you give us an insight in the challenges that you face in Canberra in getting the issues about the future of the workforces and automation onto the political agenda?
Yes, it is a challenge in that a lot of traditional industries, and I suspect a lot of people in the room would experience this as well in your own workplaces. There's a lot of focus on the traditional bread and butter, traditional organisational issues or industry issues, and people don't necessarily, and I think that there is a real challenge about lifting digital literacy within Canberra. There are a number of people that I do see that have an active interest in this area, but again, because the smorgasbord of issues is so broad, people will pick and choose, and I've always stuck in this area in terms of tech and the digital economy, because from jobs that I'd been in prior to being a politician, I'd seen that the impact of tech on labour markets can be significant, and that instead of lurching away from that challenge, it's better for us to actually prepare, deal with them head on, and do things in a way that will maximise benefit longer term. So I think as Parliament refreshes and more sort of younger generation people come through that have become a lot more acquainted with technology, I imagine that this will have an influence. But I think the other big thing will be too that within government, the challenge of digital transformation and the reality that every single portfolio will need to be able to grapple with tech a lot better will force people across an organisational hierarchy to get a lot more familiar with what's required, both in the sense of what's needed for the more efficient operation of departments, through to what's required in terms of regulatory change as well, and in terms of Rocky's contribution today, particularly the emphasis on platforms. I think, if we can drop the reference, I think we sort of get to the point of a use-by date for, the fourth industrial revolution. It's happening now. It's really manifested itself in platform economics, platform revolutions, really challenging the way that regulators and existing industries deal with technology.
As a policymaker yourself and prospective cabinet minister, from the Labour side of politics, how do you straddle the divide between the issue of automation as it pertains to fears about the future of people's jobs versus the knowledge that business can actually work better? Does it put you in a tricky position or an exciting one?
Well, it does, especially when you look at it, the side of politics that I'm a part of, that I represent in terms of the Labor Party, a lot of its initial momentum was gained in grappling with the impact of the Industrial Revolution and the start of the other century, and being able to get a sense of how people are treated in the world of work as we moved into a more industrial setting for labour. It but also things such as the impacts of that change, be it, for example, in areas of environmental reform and the way in which corporations and companies behave within a community. It's always been a challenge for us. It's particularly a challenge now where there are a lot more concerns about the impact that technology will have on labour markets. If you look at some of the work that's gone out so far, particularly with the IMF recently, saying that this will have a big impact. It was pretty dark in terms of the paper that was brought out around May of this year, but its biggest impact, Paul, that it flagged was on people with low skills attainment, low education attainment. So it's a precursor to the debate that's going to be had, I think, which is what economies and countries do in the area and the whole realm of investment in human capital and the urgency to lift that beyond what we've got right now.
And what role does Canva play in this? I mean, you obviously have a largely business audience here, and organisations will make their own decisions. What role do you see Canva playing in this? I mean, is there a role in terms of legislating in terms of if jobs are lost, any support payments? How do you...
I think as much as things have changed, the role for government will largely remain the same, if I can put it this way. And I know that doesn't sound really earth-shattering, but where government will have a role to play is probably, as much as I'm a fan of technology, I notice when I mix with technology evangelists, as they were, there are a lot of people, and I've discovered this in some public fora as well, when you sort of try to raise the concerns about, embracing technology without any reservation, and you signal any sort of negative comments, some people really take it to heart. There is a role for government to be able to think about the potential impact of technology on countries, on communities. And I think in the context of the sort of tail end of the last comment from your previous question, that whole realm of human capital development, governments will have a big role to play in supporting the investment in there. That's not to say that this will all be done by government. I actually think that there is a important role in creating a collaborative effort between business and government, where, for example, businesses I know are thinking deeply about how they will retrain workforces as they experience the impact of technology on the processes that they do. And that's one of the areas that I'm thinking deeply about in terms of policy development, because as I said, I think that human capital end or areas is going to be critical. And so I do think there is definitely some work to be done and a leadership role by government in that space, working with business, because some businesses, while they do know that they can flick the switch, and we've seen some of this in the financial services area, they can flick the switch really quickly to automation. They've held back because they know the community pushback if they haven't got their act together on it. But ultimately, and I'll leave on this point, something that you mentioned in your question, I think is absolutely vital. I think it's important that government stresses that technological change will be important for businesses. The improvement, the efficiency that will be gained by businesses, we cannot for 1 minute think that if we were to put our heads in the sand here, that businesses in other parts of the world would ignore the potential prospect of the benefit that will flow out from embracing technological change within their organisations. The minute they do it, our organisations are going to do it, so we might as well be prepared.
Now, when the former Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, first became Prime Minister, there was obviously a big focus on innovation and the ideas boom, and that sank without a trace almost after the election. You must have seen some of the polling that they saw about why they decided to step back from that kind of talk and progressive dialogue about it. What's your perception on how things have gone and why they've gone the way they have?
Well, I would love to be the beneficiary of their internal polling. It would make interesting reading. But I think we can assume, based on what you were saying in the aftermath of 2016, and I actually was saying this early on, when I saw the way in which they'd provided or put people in key positions, moved people around. Wyatt Roy and I may have had differences of opinion on different things, but we were both collaborated, worked together on trying to advance this agenda when he was in government, and obviously his losing his election or his seat had an impact on their side in terms of having someone with that energy to drive this agenda, because I just think as much as and we did applaud Malcolm Turnbull putting this on the agenda when he rose to becoming Prime Minister, because it is important. This is there's a sense of national urgency about this, about getting this right. So I think it was good that happened. But a Prime Minister can't remain focused on one issue. So you need to have other people that can pick up the flag and move forward. So once they dropped that, and then it started emerging that the reason that they'd done that is because they couldn't reconcile the fact that there was a lot of enthusiasm for this with people who are at the leading edge, who know the impact and the potential of technology, versus those who might be impacted by the implementation of that same technology. And I do think it is incumbent within parliamentary ranks to be able to see what's going on, interpret it and explain it and build support for what's happening, because just like we didn't shy away from the big changes that had to be made through the 80s and 90s in terms of economic reform, we can't do the same here.
So what can you do differently if there's an election next year? Polls suggest that you've got a good chance. What can you do differently in this agenda? You've mentioned at an AFO event about the Centre of Excellences for Artificial Intelligence. You can explain a bit more about what they would do. But what can you do differently from a policy point of view to help the broader community prepare for the changes that we're discussing today?
Well, I do think, and this is, it is tricky because, again, the multiplicity of issues that you're dealing with in the public space mean that you don't really get the opportunity to drive this on a determined, dedicated, ongoing basis. But that's just a challenge we're going to have to overcome. You were asking me before about trying to get change within political circles for this. The approach I've taken is to actually ignore Canberra and to do this type of engagement, talking with business or representatives here in these type of events, or working one-on-one with corporations, or being able to raise the issues publicly as well and using those as opportunities, right through to even in my own area where I'm doing a lot of work with particularly educational institutions in raising awareness about the digital era that's upon us and getting young people prepared for it. And I think we need to be doing that, but much greater scale. I mean, I'm just one person. We need to be able to have across Parliament doing this. And again, I see some of that happening. In terms of the policy area itself, I think the biggest thing, coming back to that issue of human capital, I think a lot of people in here would know within their own organisations. One of the biggest things I think that's holding us back, and one of the biggest things that is inhibiting the surge of our own digital economy, is a lack of talent. We can't find enough people. And the ACS, the Australian Computer Society, in their Digital Pulse report earlier this year, said there's at least 100,000 shortfall. It's been reinforced by bodies like Startup Oz. I dare say some of the stuff that we're seeing with the contraction in startup growth, and at the same time this sort of lumpy investment that we're seeing with some startups just getting phenomenal amounts of money because there's just not enough. There's the capital is there, but the human capital isn't. And at the point at which they're ready to scale up and grow, we don't have people. So both for some of the longer term policy issues that we touched on earlier, but also in terms of business need right now and putting people on sustainable employment pathways, the biggest thing in a policy sense for us is getting the whole, in terms of digital skills and the investment in that arena. That I reckon is the big policy challenge. And on top of that, longer term, being able to bring people together. You mentioned the Centre of AI Excellence that we announced earlier this year. We have tried to bring together in one place, as it were. There's a lot of stuff that's happening all over the place, and one of the things people may not be aware of is that Australia has as many AI researchers as France. So it's not like we don't have the brains, but we're doing a lot of work that needs to be joined up. And we also, within that centre, want to do two things. One is have an AI lab, which would work particularly in terms of ethical frameworks about the application of AI. But the other is to actually have the nation's first AI industry accelerator to work with industry about maximising the application of AI, but thinking about workplace issues that arise as a result of that. This is the type of stuff that we've got to focus on more and more and dedicate a greater level of investment in the years to come.
Are you concerned at all at the some of the big ethical decisions about the future of AI seemingly are being made by big tech companies, largely in the US, who haven't always proven themselves to be the arbiters of great morality.
Yeah, I think that will, and I had a roundtable yesterday actually with businesses where this issue did come up. And in Rocky's presentation, there were two things right at the tail end in terms of the big issues. He listed one was cyber and being prepared for cyber, and then the second was I think it was APIs and then AI. And I actually think in that area of APIs and AI, and this is going to be weird when I say this to you all, that's actually going to be the next competition law focus, I reckon. The way in which firms will allow access via APIs or deny access will be an issue, and the way in which AI is structured to make decisions. For example, in the financial services space, if you're offering products dynamic interest rate setting based on AI, and if you start to get variations that people begin to question, there will be a question legitimately asked about, well, how's the algorithm being set up to drive this? And I see that longer term as an issue. I think I've been influenced in part by thinkers like Microsoft's CEO saying earlier this year that the AI black box is going to need to be opened up. And I think that's legitimately going to happen, because as much as people love to see AI as a predictive platform, it's completely and utterly dependent on historical data and the influences of people who set that up themselves, as we've seen in terms of the biases that might arise from AI being applied in different formats. So, I do think longer term that is going to be an issue, and I think I think there is, and I may be naive or foolish in putting this thought forward, Paul, but I do think tech companies are recognising that in different jurisdictions, the view that because it's a US firm and therefore the way that they operate is sacrosanct and cannot be influenced by local jurisdictions is being tested all over the place. If you want examples of that, look at what's happening in the area of taxation, look at what's happening in terms of the way in which regulation responds to the arrival of big firms like Uber and other disruptors like Airbnb. More and more, I think this whole notion that tech would be regulation light and tax light, that notion is now well and truly eroding, and it will be the big thing that will be dependent on, or this will all be dependent on, is the quality of thinking within regulatory circles to be able to deal with this.
Now, I did promise that there could be questions from the floor, because as a journalist I tend to monopolise things. So Ed's hoping to be a cabinet minister soon. You've got a chance to ask a question of a future member of the government.
There are no chickens to be counted here.
No, that's right. Do we have any questions from the floor at all? Oh, that's funny. If you just say, when you get the microphone, if you name yourself and say who you are, we've got, it's all right, dodge along the front here, so we get some context.
Hi. I just want to ask...
all I can see is your glasses.
No,
don't stand.
That's okay. So I just want to ask, what is government doing to achieve a balance between the technological front or the advancements and bridge the gap with the organizations? With my organization, we have partnered with a company called Hatch, which is providing us with some graduates or who are in the process of graduation. Before they graduate, they come to us and they do an industry-wide training with us. But that's totally a next-gen initiative, a BRG group we have, which is doing that. And that's a partnership with external organization. So is something government looking into that space to partner with businesses or organizations so that they can bridge the gap of the skill gap between the students who are studying in the university, who can actually go and have a real-time training in organizations which they want to work with in future?
Okay, good question. So you would expect this partisan comment from me, so I'll keep it very light in terms of that element. From what I can see with the current government, I don't see much evidence of that, right? And if people feel otherwise, I'm more than happy to stand corrected. In terms of our side, if we were to win government, I think you would see a different approach. The reason why? We have a number of things that are happening. I mean, we set aside a dedicated portfolio on future of work issues within our opposition. It's the first time it's happened. I was in that role until recently. It's now been taken by Terry Butler, who's a great friend of mine and someone who thinks a lot about innovation issues, and one of those people that I said earlier is coming through that carries these thoughts about how we structure in response to technology. And so we have a number of people that think about it within our show. We have also one of the biggest platforms to find a way to work with business along the lines of what you're saying is that Tanya Plibersek is heading up, and again, if we are successful in the election, we've announced that we would set up a post-secondary education review. It sounds disconnected to your question, but what it's designed to do is ensure that people who, once they've finished their initial round of education, as it were, in terms of achieving either graduating from university or finishing at TAFE, where do they go next, and how do we see better linkages between tertiary, higher education, vocational education and industry, so that we can see a lot more dynamic approach to the way in which skills are acquired and refreshed. And you'll see that the concern and the type of things that we've been pushing as an opposition over the last, nearly 2 years in this area around the whole issue of future of work is now starting to infuse itself in the thinking across portfolios, so that it will be a feature of thinking. And we do want to work with business on this. I mean, I've had very good dialogue with the Business Council of Australia on this. I commended them on the release of their recent report that talked about the need for Australian business, again picking up on one of the comments that was expressed in the last presentation about the reticence to innovate and the reticence to embrace automation. And I think their report was a very strong signal to the broader community that we need to embrace this, and we do see it as very important to work with industry in being able to not just have one-off action, but dedicated rolling action, because that's what's going to be required.
Thank you for the question. And also, as I mentioned, Mohit was speaking to some of his clients and industry beforehand and had some questions that he wanted to raise as well. You've probably got time for a couple before we kick Ed off the stage. So welcome back, Mohit, with a couple of questions.
I've been kicked out of question time, so I'm used to this.
Thanks, Ed, for coming here. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks for the invite, mate.
So as we're also live online, and about, I think about 50 people are live currently on live webcast, and then it will be also available as a recording for people, our followers in US and UK who are sleeping currently because time zone differences. We have received some questions, and we have this feature on our summit that people can submit the questions on the web to us, and we have got questions for you, and I'm just trying to represent the industry side of things for asking these questions. Bill Gates is promoting taxation on automation, because when something gets automated, there are some jobs which were supposed to be done by a human are done by a machine now, which means there is no salary, which means there is no taxation.
No payroll tax, yep.
So what are your views, like your personal views on this particular issue of taxation on automation?
Well, let's make news at your conference. I'd like to announce that Labor will be endorsing a robot. No, we will.
A robot tax.
I just watch it. He was like, no, Paul. There are two features of the debate around automation, Mohit, that I think reflect a sense of when you've given up all hope of having a positive and planned approach to these things, then you reach for these levers. One is robot tax, and the other is UBI, or Universal Basic Income, right? Whenever I talk to people, groups of people about this, they always go, well, we might need a universal basic income. Yeah, we will. If unemployment goes through the roof and we haven't prepared for what is coming, then yeah, we absolutely will. In a system that is one of the most targeted welfare systems on the planet, and where we are actively trying to reconsider how we deal with things like lifting New Start, this is not an easy area to deal with, and the integration of a concept like UBI with that type of welfare system will be a challenge in itself. I would rather us think ahead about what is the likelihood of this change impacting various sections of our labour market, and how do we prepare for that. And if I can say, and I think the robot tax, if anything is useful about it, it does focus the mind on what happens if we just let this run rampant and we haven't prepared, where there will be calls on government because of impacts on declining revenue to make up the revenue somewhere else. And we do need to think about it. The other challenge, I think, if I can say this to the business community, is not to look at automation and that these things in the preparing element that I touched on. This whole concept that future of work issues will be just dealt with by pulling a folder, a training package off the shelf and then rolling it out. I don't think that necessarily is going to be a helpful concept. This is going to challenge the way in which the employment arrangements within a firm are structured. The commitment that is made to employees, and by employment arrangements I mean the offering that's provided. Jennifer Hewitt in the Fin Review recently said all the views that future of work issues would decimate employment are wrong, because if you look at employment in most advanced economies, it's going down. Okay, but that's not the only measure of what's going on. Look at the experience of underemployment, where people feel that the type of job that they have is not as secure as they'd like, or not paying as much as they'd like. Wages being stagnant. People wanting more full-time work, not just being offered part-time and casual. There is another dimension to this that needs to be considered, and it will, and I don't for 1 minute think this is not difficult for business to deal with, but I think this is where one of these pressures will emerge about how business structures in response to automation and the employment offering that's provided. Or we will get more calls for robot tax, and we will get more calls for universal basic income to respond.
I think you've probably got time for one more question, Mohit.
Sorry,
Politicians speak
I will
quickly.
be an anti-politician, speak for less.
Yeah.
So, on the lighter note, no horses were given carrots, but sticks when they were replaced by the automation or automobiles. And currently in US, where we have the lowest unemployment rate, they're the most automated economy in the world. So, I think it is quite contrary what Bill Gates is saying. It is not always that automation will lead to job losses.
Yeah, it's true, and change will also create jobs, but it'll also impact on people, right? And I totally get that. But as I said a few moments ago, I think we need to broaden our view of what is the key test of the impact of automation. We're in an environment where you would assume the application of technology and the productivity uplift that's resulted from that on the traditional view was that increased productivity could fund wage increases, and people have, what's happened to wages? They've gone completely flat.
Yeah.
So there's something else that's happening that we need to be mindful of. But I do get the point, and I think what's valuable about that point that you made, Mohit, is that we should not just think of cataclysmic repercussions due to automation. And again, just as I'm saying, we need to have nuance on some of this stuff in relation to unemployment. We shouldn't, it's about just charting the middle course, not being totally emotionally uplifted and positive about it, and not being totally dire about it, just getting on with the job.
So one more question which we have got is that Rocky pointed out the culture in Australia when innovation is not promoted because the failure is a big deterrent here. We are a small firm, but we are growing, and we see that we only have 4 insurance companies, 4 banks. If we fail at one bank, we have lost the whole market. So there is no protection of the small firm to innovate. And in the new economy, digital economy, you have more innovations, and the probability of failing is more higher. So how the government will be bracing itself for the startups to fail and change that culture?
Well, I actually think, if I can argue slightly contrary to some of the points you made, some of those smaller firms are quite happy to challenge the status quo, and are quite happy to press with changes to the way things are done, to the extent that they are scaring some of the bigger firms because they've been able to much more quickly come up with concepts and bring them to reality. So I think some of those smaller firms are doing quite well in that area. It's been a bit puzzling, sort of seen some of the stuff that's come out of Startup Muster and the suggestion that startup growth in Australia has not just plateaued but contracted.
So that's the annual report of the startup ecosystem.
Yeah. And to me it's weird, like you'd expect a political response from me. I'm not going to engage in that. I'm more interested to look at, we've made a number of big changes to support some of the firms. So your question asked about what support can be provided. We've changed taxation arrangements to allow angel investors to now be able to back smaller firms and write that off on their tax. And we've provided a lot more loosening of the reins around VC and supported some of those changes. We've put those through. We changed the employee share ownership arrangements, and we're watching with interest what the government's going to propose in the next version of that. And we've done some of these things, and yet still the growth we've experienced is not growth, there's contraction. So one of the things, as I said, is that we do need to invest in making sure that the people around to help those firms go from the S to the M in the SME equation. And we do need to, I think, for governments, put a lot more emphasis on human capital development. And if there are other things that people think can be done, certainly open to them. I've argued for things like, for example, having a greater focus by the Future Fund on local industry, but specifically startups and venture capital here, because if they do invest in VC, it's not a completely risky asset class by the Future Fund, and they've done it in the US, but they haven't done it necessarily to the same degree here. But having said that, I don't think capital is in shortage here for smart new firms. It's having the people there to take them to drive that growth. And I've got to say to you, as much as a politician would love to announce a grants program and be able to go and say we're going to provide all this money for startups, I've got to tell you, I loathe that as a policy approach. I would much rather have the things that government can do best being the focus, and if it's a chase for money, then I think we need to find the way in which the market is being able to extend that money and pressure test the propositions that are seeking that money. That's the type of thing that I think needs to happen more.
The last question, if I may ask.
Go on then.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Paul. And so, in the new digital economy,
he's going to do a Trump on you and get an intern to take the mic off you. And then you'll be banned from your own conference.
Yeah. No, we have one value of self-disruption, which I will not use today. Mm-hmm. But one question which has come is that in the
self-disruption was waking up, but think about it.
Yeah.
Oh, or not. It's a tough crowd.
See, if we will not do it, somebody else will do it. So better us do it, So one question which comes is that in the new digital economy, the tenure of the employment will be very short. It will not be like 9 years working in one company forever. And which also means that they will be out of job for more time, which means more pressure on the government for the dole. How are you going to balance that in the new digital economy where the tenure of the employment is not long, which means more pressure on the government, which means that the super funds also have to support the millennials when they grow old?
Okay, well that's a really tricky one because it's dependent on assumptions or research as to what might happen down the track in terms of impacts on employment and whether or not periods of unemployment will go longer. I think it's one of those things I was saying earlier about the challenge to business about how you invest in your own people, the type of training that might be provided to upskill people as processes are automated and technology is implemented in a way that does radically influence or impact on labour. But there are some interesting things in the current environment. If you look, for example, most people think technology impacts on older people and age discrimination kicks them out quicker. If you look at the cohort of 55 to 59-year-olds in Australia, the rate of unemployment amongst that older age group is half the national unemployment rate. But when people find themselves out of employment, they're out for something like 71, 72 weeks. And when you look at that cohort of people that's unemployed, what's the biggest thing that stands out as to why they're unemployed? What do they share in common? Low skills attainment. It's like what I said earlier, IMF saying automation is going to have the worst effect on low income and low skill attainment groups, and we're already seeing it in unemployment now. And the fact that we have, one of the weird things to me is we've got, this isn't a startling revelation, so please, I'm not making it that way, because this is often reflected on in skill shortages in other areas, but we have 700,000 unemployed in Australia right now, and we have 100,000 as a minimum shortage in digital skills. So it shows you that there is something structural in the economy where we can't, and I'm not saying you can easily transfer that 700,000 over to the 100,000 shortfall. But what is it that we're seeing that's creating that huge pool here that can't be used to address another deficit over there? These are the type of things we do need to think about as a government. They'll largely be the responsibility of government to think about, but I do think if we can collaborate with business and industry on this, I think we'd be much better for it.
Yeah, I mean, like a truck driver, the world of self-driven trucks can't be upskilled to do AI work. It's difficult for him to be upskilled compared to a normal blue-collar job guy be upskilled.
Well, I do have my friends in the Transport Workers Union who make the similar point, but also know that the role of a driver in an era where there will be automated vehicles will be different. And I think the social license about having automated vehicles, I do know Waymo over in California has now got the okay to actually have completely like driverless trials of their vehicles. So I imagine it'll come more and more, but the willingness of people to accept a completely driverless vehicle and not having someone there to be able to take over, this will be an interesting question to tease out. And the only reason I say that, Mohit, is because it probably gives us a bit more time to think and prepare for these things. But the amount of time that we have is generally up for grabs.
Well, thank you very much, Ed.
Thanks, Mohit.
And yeah, join me in thanking the Shadow Minister for the Digital Economy,
Yes.
Ed Husic.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Thanks, Mohit. Thank you.